Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much, all of you, for tuning in, as it were, to an Anglo-Swedish Society evening event. As you know, we've been doing a few of these Zoom calls now, and I think it's a great way to continue the work of the Society, to have us meet and see each other, rather than disappear completely in this long period. What I'm going to do is do a brief introduction of our speaker in a moment, and then our speaker, whom I'll introduce in a second, will give us a very entertaining lecture, after which we're going to have some questions directed by Eric, my colleague here, and then we'll open up the session for people to ask Caroline, who's our speaker, to help them with some ideas and things they want to know more about in the Baltic region. So before I do that, I'll just say that we're really pleased as well. One of the great things about the adaptation that we've made to the difficult circumstances we're now operating in is that it's brought together a number of the Scandinavian family societies. So we have membership, we have people here from the Swedish-British Society, the Society of Swedish Engineers, the British-Estonian Society, the Anglo-Finns, the Anglo-Danes, the Confederation of Scandinavian Societies, and representatives from Norway. So that's a tremendous turnout. And I think after we get back to normal, let's be optimistic, what we should try to do is do a little bit more like this. As well as have meetings in person, we could also live stream them on Zoom and increase the number of people who can actually, as it were, attend, even if remotely. Anyway, that's where we are there. Now, our star turn for the evening is Caroline Boggis-Rolfe, and she's going to start talking to us in a moment. I'll just do a very brief introduction to into who she is. I first met her actually at her book launch. We'll be showing the book in 1 second. Which was at Owl Bookshop in Kentish Town in the spring of 2019. And it was a very interesting book launch, and there were a lot of people there and a lot of interest in her book. So Caroline, after briefly studying at the University for Foreigners in Perugia, and then graduating from London University with a BA in Italian, Caroline and her husband spent some time abroad, but then after a period in Berlin, they went with their 2 young children to Rome. And after 5 years in Italy, she became a teacher of English as a foreign language. She returned to England, taught at a county preparatory school for the next decade, and then the whole family moved to London. And there she took a final diploma with the Institute of British Linguists, and then became a part-time employee of the Foreign Office as an accompanying officer for its overseas visitors. That must have been really interesting to do. However, wanting to return to academia, she decided to go back to UCL. Now, my colleague on what's my right here has just begun a course as a PhD in UCL. So even though it's not somewhere I've been to, I do know it's outnumbered, but it's held in very high regard. And where Caroline went, she completed a master's in French in the theory of literature before taking a PhD on a very interesting subject, Voltaire and tolerance in the Enlightenment. Subsequently, she spent many years lecturing on cruise ships and for charity events. And then I think very, very appositely and very bravely, she was encouraged to put some of these lectures into book form. So she started to write, and she then completed her first book on the history of the Baltic region, and she's begun her second. So let me show you Exhibit A, members of the court, Baltic Story by Caroline Boggis-Rolfe by Amberley Publishers. It's a super read, very reasonably priced. And I would recommend you try and get hold of a copy if you can. So there we have it. We are very lucky to have Caroline speak to us this evening, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what she's got to say on a topic of 1,000 years of Baltic relations. Caroline.
Thank you so much, David. Can you hear me? Is it working?
Yes.
Oh, good. I think that probably I feel rather embarrassed to be here tonight because everybody seems to be a Scandinavian, and you probably wonder what on earth is English woman doing is talking to you about it. But I started the book because I was really struck how the Baltic story, all the Scandinavian countries and the Baltic countries had really been ignored by most English people, and there was very little about it in English literature. So I tried to write an introductory book, bringing them all together, all these areas, for the average reader. I don't pretend it's a definitive version for all academics. It's trying to introduce this interest in English readers. Right, what I'm basically looking at tonight, because the Baltic story, it covers, as David said, the whole region from Russia, Estonia, and right through. But as we were talking to the Anglo-Swedish Society, I thought we would first of all look at really the interaction between Denmark and Norway and Sweden and Finland, and why this tension grew up. Now, right at the beginning, if we go back to the time of the Vikings had gotten a very important commercial center here in Visby on Gotland. And of course, it's going to be trade that really drives the conflict to start with. And so in the 13th century, Visby was so much the object of jealousy with other people, it built these magnificent walls that still exist around the city of Visby to protect it. These were constructed in the 13th century, but already by that time, in the 12th century, they were facing competition from this other commercial gathering of the Hansa, or what the British tend to call the Hanseatic League, although they're not really a league, they're just an association of trading people. And they grew originally from their beginnings here at Lübeck and Hamburg, out along the coast, as you can see, then down the rivers to Cologne and beyond. And over the next few centuries, they will become all powerful. However, in 1361, the Danish king, Valdemar IV, Atterdag, he wanted to extend his influence. And he, by this time, had really united Denmark, even having taken Skåne in 1360. But now in 1361, he actually attacks Gotland and takes the city of Visby. And this is where you see this famous story that was later painted in this later painting of how he demanded all the silver and gold from the people of Visby. And this would be the beginning of their problems, really, because over the next years and centuries, they would come under attack from the pirates, from the Teutonic Knights, from the Hansa, and also from Sweden. So it begins to move out of sight. But the really interesting thing about Valdemar is that when he died, he left a daughter, Margaret. And of course, this is her effigy that appears on her magnificent tomb in Roskilde Cathedral. Now, Margaret was not just Valdemar's daughter, but she was also the widow of Håkon VI of Norway. And at this time, the Swedes thought that she would make a good ruler too. So they elected her as their ruler. And so she now brought these three countries together, three independent kingdoms united under her in what became known as the Kalmar Union. This is in 1397. And being united like this, they were better able to tackle the problems of the Hansa and also the pirates. And I should have mentioned just before her father had died, the Hansa had actually defeated the Danish king in a big battle. So they were really at the peak of their power now. However, the Danes didn't want to have a female ruler as such, not a monarch as such. So she now appointed her great nephew, Boggis-Rolfe of Pomerania, to become the king of the Kalmar Union. And he decided it was better to have a sort of more Scandinavian sounding name. So he became known as Erik. And after Margaret died, Erik ruled on his own. And it was then in 1429 that he came up with this brainwave, you might say. He realized that he had a really strategic possession in these straits through the Sound. Now, although the belt appears to be wider, I'm not a sailor myself. I believe they are more difficult to navigate. But what's more, the belt was the waterway for the Danes. This was the international waterway through the Sound. And here at Helsingborg, the Sound is only about 5 kilometers wide. And Erik, therefore, decided this was the ideal place to create a toll station. He would demand sound dues on everybody going through the waterway. Now, of course, this was in some ways a real advantage for Denmark in the years to come. Whenever they were short of money, they could just raise the sound dues and get more wealth. But the disadvantage was that it would lead to friction, not just with the Swedes, but with others as well. Later the British, the Dutch and others, all who needed this way into the Baltic. And of course, remembering over the years to come, when the British Navy and the Dutch Navy got more important, they had to come into the Baltic to get many of their supplies, the timber, the hemp, the tar, and all the rest of it. So the Sound was of key importance. However, Eric wasn't much success otherwise, and he was then deposed. And although followed by his nephew, he didn't stay around for very long. And it was in 1448 that the first of the Oldenburg kings came to the throne, Christian I, in, as I say, 1448. But by now, the Kalmar Union was shaking, you might say. It wasn't so secure. And it was that same year that the Swedes had decided they didn't want to have a Danish ruler, and they chose their own king, Karl Knudsen. He didn't have 100% easy time of it because he was twice deposed, but he remained in power till his death, and then was succeeded by his nephew, Sten Sture the Elder, who was regent. So those sort of 50 years, the second sort of half century of the 15th century, the Kalmar Union is struggling a bit. However, by the 1500s, things have recovered a bit, but not for long. Because in 1513, the new Danish king came to the throne, Christian II. And he was accepted now as the Danish king and as the Norwegian king, but the Swedes were still doubtful about him. And it took him 10 years to convince them that he should be their king as well. And then, unfortunately, it all went wrong. Because shortly after his coronation in 1513, he invited all the nobles who had opposed him to a banquet, and the doors were slammed, and with that they were rounded up, and over the next few days they were massacred in Stockholm. This was, of course, the Stockholm bloodbath. And of course that would lead on to other horrors around the country afterwards. But it was this really that brought the Kalmar Union to the end. The Swedes now referred to him as Christian the Tyrant, and they certainly did not want him as their ruler. And meanwhile, there was one person who had escaped this horror, although his father had been killed in the massacre, and that was Gustav of the Vasa family. And he at the time was in Lübeck, and Lübeck, of course, this Hansa city, the one thing it really was quite keen to do was to see the end of this Kalmar Union, which had been a sort of competition to them. And so it was with the help of the Hansa that he was now brought back to Sweden, where he then managed to take the throne, and he became Gustav I of the Vasa family. It's worth mentioning, of course, that with this, the Kalmar Union was finished. And from now on, Norway would stay loyal to Denmark, but it would gradually become more and more like a province of Denmark. Denmark was the sort of the ruling partner there. However, during Gustav's reign, it would last for over 30 years. There were two other quite sort of important things which are worth mentioning. Of course, one was this was the period when the Reformation was introduced to Scandinavia. And the other thing was that he now brought in a hereditary monarchy. So as a result, when he died in 1560, he was followed by the first of his three sons who would succeed him. This is Eric the 14th. Of course, the number is rather arbitrary. They sort of thought of a sort of good sounding number. But Eric the 14th was soon at odds with his cousin, the Danish king. The two men were connected to their mothers, and they came to the throne just a year apart. And very quickly, they both wanted to assert their presence, if you like. And in the case of the Danish king, he wanted to revive that Kalmar Union. And so within 3 years of Eric coming to the throne, the Northern 7 Years' War broke out. Now, at the end of this war, Eric, well, the Swedes had just gained Estonia, But for the Danes, it was particularly significant because they now had guaranteed that these regions, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but up here in Helen, Skåne and Blekinge, these regions now were Danish. However, by the time that this treaty concluded this war, Eric had already been deposed. He'd become mentally very unstable, and he was deposed by his brother, John. Now, John, unfortunately, may be the person who was responsible for his death. Whatever happened, Eric went to prison and he did die of arsenic poisoning. But the thing that's more important, I think, for us now about John was that his first wife was this young woman, Katerina Jegelian of Poland. And she was a devout Catholic, so he allowed her to bring up their son, Sigismund, as a Catholic. So in 1592, when John died, a strange situation arose. In that, Sigismund by now had been elected the King of Poland, but he also, because it was a hereditary monarchy, inherited the throne of Sweden. Now, remembering that Sweden had now become a Protestant country, this did not go down particularly well. Above all, with his uncle, this is the third of those sons of Gustav Vasa, or Gustav I, and this man was a devout Calvinist. The one thing he didn't want was his nephew, who was living abroad anyway, becoming the new Catholic King of Sweden. So he mounted a revolt, and he managed to defeat his nephew, who then went back to Poland. And Karl later became Karl IX. But of course, this would begin a real tension, create a real tension between Sweden and Poland, the two countries, both with Rasa kings who were related but opposed to each other. Now, meanwhile, in Denmark, there'd been now several years of peace since the end of that Northern 7 Years' War. And this allowed the king, Frederick II, who'd come to the throne just a year before Eric, he was able to create his more sumptuous court. He had money from the Sound Jews. In fact, he was a suitor for Queen Elizabeth and also for Mary Queen of Scots. So you can see the sort of world he was moving in. And he would spend his almost 20 years after the war building some of these magnificent castles that, of course, we see in Denmark today. Now, this one of the most famous, Kronborg, was built on the site where Eric had his Sound Jews. They built a castle to raise his Sound Jews. And as it's right by Helsingør, of course, it's the castle that is famous in the story of Hamlet. Another interesting connection, I think, for perhaps the British members of your society, is the fact that the year after the king died, in other words, in 1589, his daughter Anne would be married here by proxy to James VI of Scotland and James, who was later James I of England, so the mother of the later Stuart kings. However, having died, it meant that with Eric Frederick having died so early, you might say, it was his son, Christian IV, who now came to the throne, aged only 11. Now, during his reign, he too would add to this building program, I might say. He would increase the size of the Danish navy. And I shouldn't be telling Danes what to think, because I know there are a lot of Danes here tonight, but I believe he's still very popular with the Danes. But he had a difficult reign. It was the longest of all the Danish kings. It lasted 59 years. And in that time, he was drawn into various wars, which would leave the country impoverished and would lead to the beginning of their loss of territory. Now, one of the reasons he got involved in these wars was largely because by this time, Karl IX of Sweden had died, and he'd left his son, Gustav II Adolf, who we British, I think, tend to call Gustavus Adolphus. I'm not certain how much that is used in Sweden. But I'll refer to him as Gustavus Adolphus because it differentiates him from the others. Now, he immediately picked up where his father had left off, and so at once he was at war with the Danes. This again was all to do with the access to the Baltic, the dislike of those Sound Jews, and the wanting to gain more territory. This first war only lasted 2 years, and it didn't actually cover Gustavus Adolphus with glory. But after that, he would go on, and he would have much more success in the eastern part of the Baltic, gaining important territories we'll see later from the Russians and from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. He then returned to take part in the 30 Years' War that was now raging in Europe. This map, I think, is particularly horrific because it does show, I don't know if you can read it, but down here, all these orangey areas where 66% of the population, if not more, were killed, 33 in the yellow areas. However, here, Gustavus Adolphus again would prove himself a military champion, much more so than actually Christian IV had managed to achieve a few years earlier in that same war. And he became sort of admired by the Protestant cause, although, of course, we've got to be careful not to think that the 30 Years' War was strictly on religious lines. It wasn't. People joined up with who served their purpose. But it was eventually here, near Leipzig at Lützen, that Gustavus Adolphus was killed in the midst of battle, aged only 37. Now, this was obviously a disappointment for those who he'd supported in the war, but it was also of concern to the Swedes because he'd left just a 5-year-old daughter, Queen Christina. However, once she'd grown up, she too would pick up this same argument with the Danes. She too didn't like the Sound Jews or wanted more to ensure their territory in the south. And so another war broke out between them, which eventually ended just 3 years before Christian IV died, and equally 3 years before the end of the 30 Years' War. And this was really the beginning of problems for the Danes, because now they began to lose their dominance in the Baltic. And apart from losing 2 places that are not on this map, Jämtland between Norway and Sweden further north, and the island of Ursel just off Estonia, they lost Gotland, which is behind all these pictures here. I don't know if you can see it, and even had to give over Helland for the next 30 years. It was, in fact, they would never get it back, but it was on loan at this time to Sweden. And on top of that, the Swedes had exemption from the Sound Jews, the thing that they'd rarely been wanting. However, 9 years later, 9 years later, the Swedes would have their own problems, because shortly after Queen Christina had had the most extravagant coronation, she announced suddenly that she was going to abdicate. And what's more, she, the daughter of the great Protestant leader, was going to convert to Catholicism and go and live in Rome. And this meant that the crown now passed to her first cousin, Karl, who was going to become Karl X. He was Karl of the Palatinate. Now, he would spend the next 6 years of his reign, it was a short reign, mostly at war. And the year after he came to the throne, he decided he wanted to go to the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and try and gain some more territory, the territory that Gustavus Adolphus had failed to gain. He actually didn't achieve this, and all that would happen at the end of the war would be that he made the Swedes very unpopular by their pillaging and looting of the land. But it was a terrible time for the Polish king, who found himself in this period called the Deluge, not just invaded by the Swedes here on the left, but this pale green area overrun by the Russians. And the Polish court had to escape down to Silesia in the south here. It was one of their sort of most horrific times. However, soon Karl X had to leave. And that was because, yet again, he found himself under pressure from the Danes, because the Danish king was now threatening the king's possessions in northern Germany. I'll be showing a map in a minute. Sorry, forgive me. Now, he marched up the Jutland Peninsula, but it was midwinter, there was no ships, they were all in harbour. And the problem was, of course, how to get across to Zeeland and take on the king. And then, of course, early in the year, early in 1658, they had a very cold spell and the sea froze. And then Karl X carried out his great thing for which he's so famous, his crossing of the belts. Remembering this is the Great Belt here, crossing from Fredericia here on the mainland through the islands and eventually meeting the king at Roskilde, where a treaty was then agreed, followed by this magnificent banquet. Now, the Treaty of Roskilde was incredibly tough on the Danes, so much so that soon the Swedish king began to doubt that the Danes were going to honour the agreement. And so he again declared war on the Danes, and he now blockaded the Sound, that important waterway, and put Copenhagen under siege. Luckily for the Danes, at this point, their allies, the Dutch, who had been their allies since the time of Queen Christina, now came to their rescue, and they managed to defeat the Swedish fleet and open up the Sound again. But of course, the blockade of the siege of Copenhagen still was going on. And finally, about 3 months later, the last assault was made on Copenhagen, and the Danes actually managed to hold out, and the Swedes finally had to retreat. But the thing that was so important about this siege was that the king and queen, who are sort of depicted in this picture here, in other words, Frederick III, the son of Christian IV, Frederick III and his wife were so brave throughout this siege that he was now granted the right to be an absolute ruler, and the monarchy now became hereditary. And it would remain hereditary right through, remain absolute right through to 1848, which is going to be quite significant, as we'll see later. It's also possibly worth mentioning at this point, as from now on, he would try and build up his court and the importance of the Danish monarchy, and they would contract various important marriages for their children, which would of course lead to big problems in 2 generations' time when cousins were against cousins. But this one that I put here wasn't involved in the later problems, but I thought it would interest the English speakers here tonight, because he was George, who married the future Queen Anne, Stuart Queen Anne of England and Scotland. And of course, if Anne's children had survived, we would have had an Oldenburg dynasty in England instead of a Hanoverian. However, the year after that siege, or after the assault on Copenhagen, finally another treaty was drawn up at Copenhagen. And this treaty really ratified what had been said at Roskilde, with the exception of Bornholm here was given back to the Danes, and Trondelag, which had this terrible effect of cutting Norway in two, that was returned to the Norwegians. But all the rest had remained, and in particular, we see here all the regions on the west side of the peninsula, the regions that were taken now by Karl X, and how much they now controlled the Sound. Another thing I think is worth pointing out on this map is these regions over here in Karelia, Ingria, and Livonia, because they're the regions that Gustavus Adolphus had captured, and it would be of great significance, because you might notice on the map that now Russia is cut off from the Baltic. It cannot carry out its trade in the Baltic, and this will become a major issue in later generations. However, by 1660, when this treaty was finally drawn up, Karl X was dead. He had contracted a cold, and it had turned into complications, and he died, leaving just a 4-year-old son. So, of course, there was now a regency. However, when that son, Karl XI, reached 19, he would be drawn again into war. This was partly because the French and the Brandenburgers were at odds with each other, and because of the treaties, he was drawn into their war. But this meant that the Danes now saw their opportunity. They thought, he's so tied up with this, we're going to invade Skåne, and we're going to try and recapture those vital lands that we lost in that those treaties of Roskilde and Copenhagen. And they did achieve gains during this war, but because of the nature of the the general international affairs, if we say the other wars that were going on, when the final treaty was drawn up, the Danes were forced to hand over all the gains they'd made. In other words, they gained nothing. And the story goes that, of course, the Danish king, was now so horrified by this that he ordered all the windows at Kronborg to be boarded up so he didn't have to look across the water at those wretched enemies. However, with the end of the war, now Carl XI would go ahead with his marriage to one of those Danish princesses. We saw earlier how those dynastic marriages had been arranged. And although they'd been engaged throughout this war, it was only now that they were married. But again, this shows the sort of conflict. You had this intermarriage and yet they could still be enemies. Anyway, she would produce 3 children who survived into adulthood, and they're all important, so I'm going to point them out here. First of all, there's, of course, Carl XII, who succeeded Carl XI. His younger sister, Ulrika Eleonora, called after her mother, who succeeded after Carl XII. And this one, Hedvig, the older sister, who would one day become the grandmother of Tsar Peter III, and that will be of significance later. However, after the end of the Ascanian War, Carl XI managed to maintain the peace in his country, and he ruled so wisely that at the end of his reign, he was granted also absolute status, like his Danish neighbor. That would have been fine, except shortly after he died, and he left Carl XII, a 15-year-old now, as the absolute ruler. And of course, he would just use this full power to his own as he thought best. However, he soon showed that he had particular ability, and within 3 years, when he was still only 18, he was suddenly found himself under threat from those very cousins. The whole idea had been to bring the families together. Now his cousins, his neighbours, wanted to get back the lands they'd lost, and they all declared war on him. And from this moment on, Carl takes on this new sort of persona. He does away with his court clothes, and he now is the military man par excellence. And the first thing he does is cross the Sound, and with the help of the British and the Danish fleets, the Dutch fleets, he defeats his Danish cousin, who then drops out of the war for the time being, at any rate. But this begins this terrible conflict known as the Great Northern War that will last for 20 years. And following that, Carl then decides he's going to take on his next cousin, who is the Elector of Saxony, who has recently been elected the King of Poland. However, having crossed to Livonia here, he first of all gets distracted, well, not distracted, diverted is the word, to take on the Russians, because Peter, Tsar Peter, had now also joined the fight. His determination was, of course, to get access to the Baltic. I mentioned earlier how Russia had been cut off from the Baltic. Anyway, Karl defeats him quickly, and then he moves south, and for the next 4 or 5 years, he is campaigning here in Poland, even succeeding in deposing his cousin Augustus from the throne. And eventually, and this is a sort of irony to me, he then goes and spends the next year in Saxony, in that electorate where his deposed cousin comes from. And this is one of the things I find fascinating when doing this, is these mixed sort of relationships. You can fight somebody and yet you're at peace with them the next minute. However, after that, he decides he still wants to take on the Russians. He feels he has not sorted out Peter completely. So he sets off east. And eventually, when he's close to Smolensk here, everything begins to change. It's the beginning of one of the worst winters on record. There's plague beginning to affect some of his army. There's a shortage of food. The supply train is defeated on its way to join him. And he even at one point gets wounded himself, Karl. So by the time he meets Peter down here at Poltava in the Ukraine, where they've gone in search of food, Karl is actually lying on a litter through the battle. So it makes directing affairs even more difficult. And as a result of all these things, it ends in a major defeat for the Swedes, whereupon Karl flees down into the Ottoman Empire. Now he spends 5 years there until he eventually decides he's going to leave from here from Demotica to go back up to the Baltic area and continue the fighting that his generals are still conducting up there. And then the story is he sets off and makes his way with 2 companions on their, both of them good riders, and they speed their way across Europe and eventually arrive in Swedish Pomerania in a couple of weeks. I say this is the accepted story until recently, because for me, it was an extraordinary thing to come across. But just before I submitted my book to the publisher, I discovered the excellent research that had been done by Cecilia Nordenskjöld just recently. And she found evidence that this didn't actually happen. He went off to Paris to see the French king. Now, of course, it doesn't really matter for tonight's talk, but I think the thing about it that I find so particularly interesting is it makes one realize that one had to keep on reassessing history. It is not fixed in stone. Evidence comes up the whole time, which questions what one's believed before. However, now that same year that Karl returned to Pomerania, Peter the Great had another great success. Of course, he's called Peter the Great since his triumph at Poltava, released by the Russians. He's called Peter the Great. And he now wins a major battle here off the peninsula of Hanko, which the Russians call Gangut. It's the galleys of the Russians actually defeat the Swedish ships that are more suited to it. And further to that, Peter now invades Livonia, he invades Estonia, and he even also invades Finland. And adding to Karl's problems now, at this point, when everything's going against him, his 2 cousins, the Danish king, Frederick, and his cousin Augustus, who's now regained his throne in Poland, rejoin the fighting together with the Prussian king. So everything is really against Karl now. So when 4 years later, he's killed while he's shot while on campaign by a sniper, there's a certain sense of relief in some quarters. But the question always remains, who did actually kill him? Was it one of the Norwegians or Danes, or was it a disgruntled Swede, or, as many people argue, was it his brother-in-law? Whoever did it, the war was now coming to an end. And by 1720, it was over. And the following year, in the last treaty, Russia gained all these areas colored red. And that shows that not only Russia now has got its access to the Baltic, as well as defending St. Petersburg, which has been built during this war, but also that the tables are completely turned. Now it's Russia that is the dominant presence in the Baltic. However, by this time, Karl XII's younger sister, Ulrika Nora, had been appointed the queen, and the Riksdag then agreed that she could become queen, but there was a new constitution. It was the end of the absolutism of the monarchy, and this would be a beginning of a period known as the Age of Liberty, when the nobles gained more and more power, the monarch less and less. Now, poor Ulrika Eleonora never had any children, which will be of significance later, but she also had a problem in that she wanted to rule conjointly with her husband, Frederick of Hesse, but this wasn't allowed, and so she said later to her regret, she now abdicated in his favor. So he becomes Frederick I, the very man, we have to remember, who may well have actually been behind the murder of her brother, Karl XII. However, the country now begins to recover from the horrors of the war until the late 1730s, when the new government, the Hats as they were called, wanted to regain the lands they'd lost during the Great Northern War to Russia. And so they declare war on Russia, and this is a disaster, and within 2 years, they've lost still more of Finland. And then in the following treaty, the Empress Elizabeth, who is now the ruler in Russia, having just recently taken the throne for herself, she makes a further demand. She has no children of her own, and she wants her sister's son, Karl Peter of Holstein-Gottorp, to become her recognized heir, the Grand Duke Peter, in other words, the later Peter III. And added to that, she now arranges the marriage of Peter III, or of Grand Duke Peter, to his second cousin, the future Catherine the Great. But the problem about this, of course, is that he is actually the heir to the Swedish throne, because he's that grandson of Hedvig, in other words, the great nephew of Ulrika Eleonora, who has no children. And so a new heir must be found for Sweden. And the person who is now chosen is Catherine the Great's uncle, Adolf Friedrich. Now he, of Holstein-Gottorp. Now poor man, has a difficult reign because he is faced by the ever-growing power of the nobles, who give him considerable trouble. And he also, his hat government draws him into the 7 Years' War. They don't play a very big part in the 7 Years' War, but it's still not good for the country. The Danes, on the other hand, managed to keep out of the 7 Years' War, and they are by now growing in power. They have got their colonies abroad. They've got this is the magnificent royal palace of Christiansborg in Copenhagen. It was later burnt down, and they're also rebuilding the center of their city at Copenhagen to celebrate this 300 years of the Oldenburgs on the throne. In Sweden, however, eventually in 1771, Adolf Friedrich dies, and it's his son, Gustav III, who succeeds. Now, Gustav soon realized that the nobles were a problem. And so shortly after his coronation, he, along with some of his supporters, all wearing this white bandage to distinguish themselves, marched to the Riksdag, and they managed to retake more authority for the monarchy. They take it away from the nobles. Of course, this appeals to the people in general. And then for the next few years, he brings in many of the Enlightenment reforms that the various rulers, such as Frederick the Great in Prussia and Catherine in Russia, were trying also to introduce. But over time, this made him even more unpopular with the nobles who thought they were losing more of their powers. And so by 1788, he's having quite a lot of problems. So at that point, things come to a head. First of all, in Finland, at Anjala, a group of nobles form a conspiracy against him and even turn to Catherine the Great in Russia for help. She doesn't do much to help, but the fact is, Russia is seen as an influence in the country. And more than that, he's now also facing problems again from the Danes. And so now Gustav Adolf decides the only way to deal these problems at home is to make the usual diversion that the rulers at this time did, and that is to declare war against his cousin, Catherine the Great. The war doesn't last long, it's just 2 years, and it ends eventually with this great Swedish success at Svenskund. But I think the importance is to stress the fact that its reasons for it was to give a diversion so he could take away the tension from the problems he's having at home. But those problems hadn't gone, because only 2 years later, in 1792, here in the opera house that he created, it was later pulled down, Gustav is shot by an assassin while attending a mass ball, and he dies about 2 weeks later from the complications. Now, the news was met with horror abroad. This totally disrespectful cartoon, so typical of the time, but shows George III and Queen Charlotte in England hearing the news from Pitt. And Pitt here is saying another monarch done over here. And that gives an idea of the tensions at this time. Remembering that now that the French Revolution is in full force, Louis XVI will be sent to the guillotine the following year. And George III himself has faced other problems up to this time. He's only recently lost his colonies in America. And what's more, even 20 years before, he'd had problems with the Danes. And that was following the marriage of his younger sister, Caroline Matilda, to Christian VII. Now, Christian VII was another of these monarchs who suffered from mental problems. And over time, they realized that he needed help, and a doctor was found for him called Johann Struensee. But Johann Struensee, over an amazingly short time, manages to gather all the power to himself. The king hands over his responsibilities to the doctor. And again, we have to remember this was a period when the king was absolute. So in a sense, the doctor has become an absolute ruler. He tries to bring in a lot of reforms, rather too many, which make him unpopular, and he becomes rather arrogant. And the worst thing, however, is that he and the Queen are now conducting a totally indiscreet love affair. As a result, everything comes to a head, and in 1772 he is arrested and he's taken out and executed and quartered in Copenhagen, which means that now a more reactionary regency is formed, the king having been declared unfit to rule and the queen having been divorced and sent abroad. Now this boy who succeeds his father Christian is of course Frederick VI, who was a regent for quite a long time. In fact, didn't become king until 1808 when his father eventually died. But even during his regency, he tried to maintain the neutrality that was had been brought together by Tsar Paul with Sweden and Denmark, the armed neutrality, the coalition of armed neutrality, as it was called. Now, this, however, didn't help him when it came to in 1801, the British, remembering now that the Napoleonic Wars are at their height, the British, worried that Frederick is going to turn over to the French and they will lose their access to the Baltic, attack Copenhagen. And this, of course, is the famous battle when Nelson turned his blind eye on the instruction to withdraw. However, although the Swedes would, in the following years, again stop their neutrality, would cease their neutrality, joining the Third Coalition, Frederick of Denmark remained true to Napoleon, and so again the city was then struck 6 years later in 1807, when this time the British were determined to capture or destroy the Danish fleet, and they bombarded the city, and that made Frederick now come out openly for Napoleon, something that will cost him dear in the end. But unlike Frederick, who remained true to Napoleon, there was another who did change his allegiances, and this was the Tsar of Russia, Alexander I. And he abandoned his allies after he had lost 2 serious battles, and finally in 1807 he agreed to meet Napoleon on this very sort of stylized raft in the middle of the river Niemen up near Tilsit in East Prussia. And following this agreement, Alexander then did his side of the bargain, if you like, and in 1808 and again in 1809, he invaded Finland. So by 1809, he had occupied all this region, including making various attacks across the Gulf of Bothnia. However, by that time already, the Finns had decided they'd had enough, and they now summoned a Diet to Porvoo near Helsinki. And here the Tsar Alexander was proclaimed the Grand Duke of this Grand Duchy of Finland, autonomous state that was in personal union with Russia through the Tsar. And it was from this moment onwards, of course, that Finland broke away from Sweden. Now, because of these disasters, the young king, Gustav IV, the son of the murdered Gustav, he now was deposed, and he and his son were abdicated, and Gustav went off to live abroad in Switzerland. So a new king had to be found, and at that point it was decided that the person to choose was the, again, murdered Gustav's younger brother, in other words, Gustav IV's uncle, Karl. The problem with Karl was he was already showing the signs of early onset senility, and he was also had no children. So the problem was who was going to succeed him, because he had no living heirs. So a crown prince had to be found. And after a slight drama, when the first one unfortunately fell down dead, Bernadotte, the former the former marshal of Napoleon, was elected instead, and he now became the Crown Prince of Sweden. Now, at this point, sorry, I've lost my, I've turned the thing too fast. Well, anyway, then in say 1814, he led the Swedish army, this is Bernadotte, led the Swedish army against the Norwegians, and this was against against the Danes. This will be the last war between Sweden and Denmark. Remembering, of course, there have been about 11 in the last 200 years alone. And as a result of that, Norway was now handed over to be in union with Sweden. Bernadotte was very pleased about that because it actually compensated for the loss of Finland. But the Norwegians, who we see here, of course, weren't so keen on the idea. And they gathered here at Eidsvoll and they declared their own constitution and they elected their own king. Again, Bernadotte wasn't happy with that, and so now he attacks Sweden, attacks Norway. This is the last war that Sweden will ever fight, and having achieved that, Norway then is handed over to Sweden to be in union with Sweden. Therefore, when 4 years later, in 1818, Karl eventually dies, Bernadotte is crowned Karl XIV, John of Sweden, and 4 months later has a separate coronation in Norway as Karl III. And this period then would be sort of introduced in the 19th century, when during the 19th century, for there was a brief period when a sort of move of Scandinavianism came in, when the 3 countries, Norway, Denmark and Sweden, tried to come together a bit more. It didn't last very long, but it shows a coming together that we haven't actually seen up to date. Finland, of course, remained still in union with Russia. And so it would suffer during the Crimean War when the British and the French attacked Finland. They also bombed Boggis-Rolfe, which we see here on the Åland Islands. And in fact, some of their behavior was so bad that questions were actually asked in the House of Commons about this. One of the less sort of honourable things that the British have done. However, in 1863, there will be another change for the Danes. Because I'm sure I've been talking too long, I won't go into details with this picture, but this shows when the last Danish king died of the Oldenburg family with no children, they had to find another heir. It's worth mentioning he had actually, as he came to the throne, ended the absolutism, so he's no longer an absolute ruler. But they need an heir. And so they find a distant relation of his who becomes Christian IX from the Glucksberg family. And you can see why this king should be always known as the grandfather of Europe, because in this picture alone, we have one of his daughters, Queen Alexandra of England, with her husband, Edward VII. The younger daughter, Dagmar, later Empress Maria, wife of Alexander II. We have obviously the heir to the Danish throne with his Swedish wife, and this man here is going to become George, or has, I think perhaps in this picture, has already become King George of Greece with his Russian wife. And these two on the right, of course, interestingly enough, are Prince Philip's grandparents. However, just the year after Christian IX had come to the throne, Denmark would have another real blow when the Austrian and the Prussian armies invaded and took over the whole of this part of the Jutland right up to northern Schleswig, including northern Schleswig. Northern Schleswig was actually given back to Denmark in 1920, but you can imagine this went down really badly with the Danes, particularly with the Queen Alexandra and her sister Maria. They both absolutely had no time for Prussians at all. And so I can't believe there was great excitement when in 1895, the much hated Kaiser Wilhelm II opened the Kiel Canal on territory which actually had once been Danish anyway. But of course, by opening the canal, this had completely changed the significance of this whole Sound region that had been so important for so long. The Sound dues had been ended about 40 years before in 1857, but even so, this really changes the significance of that waterway. However, 10 years later, in 1905, Norway achieves its independence, and the Danish king sees his grandchildren become now the King Haakon the Seventh of Norway, with his wife and cousin, as it turns out to be, Queen Maud. Finland gaining its independence 12 years later. So really what I've been trying to sort of show is this constant conflict between these countries, largely based on this access to the Baltic and to access to trade. And I therefore think that really, as it's all been about conflict and competition, I've got to end with the cooperation. And here we see the marvelous bridge over the Øresund that was opened in 1991. And that really shows the opening to this new stage of greater cooperation. And that is the end of the slides. Shall I stop?
Excellent. I think yes. Let's get some faces back up on
okay.
On the
Stop
screen.
share.
Yes,
Yeah.
there we go.
Yeah, great.
So I've lost you, but oh, maybe it's going to come up now.
Yeah,
No?
probably will.
Am I?
Yes, I've got you.
Here
I've
we
got
are.
you.
Excellent.
Yeah, perfect.
Well, thank you a lot for that talk, that presentation. It was really, really interesting, really informative. Having also read your book, it's a really good sort of companion thing to it. Getting both information that's already there, but also recontextualized together with additional information that sort of paints a really broad picture to it. So just for the sake of everybody listening as well, so we're going to do now is I'm going to have a little chat with Caroline about her book and both the process of writing it, what's in the book as well, and then some talk about the presentation, and then after that I'm going to open it up to the rest of you guys to also ask some questions towards the end. So I wanted to go back to the very beginning, so to the book itself, to your when you introduced yourself, and sort of figured there's a lot of research that's got into this book. I mean, it's 1,000 years of history, so you must have read a lot of texts, a lot of scholars gone, just dug through a lot of archives and pages and everything else. And I want to start on kind of a positive note, because what was the most enjoyable part of like putting a project of this scale together?
Well, I must answer your question, but I'm just starting first. I mean, the thing was, I was very aware that for some reason, the Baltic region had been rather ignored by British speakers. It doesn't appear much in children's education at school. And I think there may be a slight problem. Some of it might even come from the fact that for my generation, at any rate, a lot of the Baltic, obviously not the Scandinavian countries, but a lot of the Baltic were off limits because of the Cold War. And people didn't actually explore it much. And so when I did start becoming really interested in it, and it developed out of my PhD because I realized how much it interested people like Voltaire, this region, and how important it'd been. And I really wanted to explore it more. The thing that really intrigued me, and what I found so enjoyable, was the way the stories interlock. If, for example, one reads a biography about some of the great individuals who are in English literature, whether it's Catherine the Great, Frederick the Great, or Gustavus Adolphus, whoever, it doesn't always tell you what the connection is with the other countries and why there's this complex connection. And it was that mixture of connectivity, and yet at the same time, the way that all these countries have managed to keep their individuality. They've got their own language, they've got their own culture, they've got their own way of life, their food, everything. And I think I just found this really interesting, that the connections, and yet why there were these divisions. I don't know if that it answers your question, but
yeah, no, of course.
This is where it really came from.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, there is this fascination. I think that's what struck me the most when reading it, was the remarkable overlap in ways that I hadn't really considered or kind of thought of things being connected. But we're going to get back to that a little bit further on. So, again, you must have read a lot putting this together. What were some of the tougher decisions you had to make in terms of what to include or things to exclude, or how to weave it all together?
Well, for me, I personally find history comes alive through people. I think if it's just facts and statistics and numbers,
dates.
one loses something. I want to know about the people behind everything, because I feel that may not explain, but it gives a reason for why decisions were made and all the rest of it. So I wanted to introduce people. That was particularly difficult in the early stage, particularly when I was writing about the Hanseatic League, because there aren't many individuals, and yet I wanted to try and find some. So some people who perhaps appear there wouldn't normally get much of a say, but it's just I'm trying to bring it more alive. As time goes on, there are more people, but I was very aware that it was such a large scope, not only in terms of time, but in geography, that there was probably little likelihood that many people would have covered all the region themselves. And I think it can be very putting off if you're reading a book. I wanted each chapter to be able to stand alone, so that you could dip into it if you wanted to, of the bits you find most interesting. But at the same time, I didn't want a chapter to be full of lots of new names, because I think then it gets very confusing if you don't know the area very well, or you don't know the subject well. So if they were famous people, well, you could pile them up because most people had heard about them. But I tried to bring in the people who most played a part. And sometimes I had to abandon people because I thought this is going too far off the what is available, what is possible for people to absorb. And of course, another thing that was a little bit of a problem, I decided that because it was about countries around the Baltic, some of those countries are vast, and yet I wanted to try as much as possible to keep within the Baltic rim, because otherwise, again, if I started going in great length about Krakow or something, we were moving into a whole new area of research. So it was those things that I had to cut out, the extra people who perhaps would confuse the issue, the extra places that just gets a mention, and yet make that each chapter so that if you only read that chapter, you weren't completely lost. You could, in fact, we are bringing out a paperback, which should have been out by now, but I think because of the virus, it's been delayed. But there, I think we're making more of an effort to have cross-references so people can find it in an earlier chapter. This was my first published book, so certain things I wish I'd done, which I perhaps would do in another thing, and that's one of the things we thought we would introduce, this clearer cross-referencing.
Yeah, because I mean, it is, as the cover says, it is 1,000 years of history. So there's a lot of material that goes into that sort of into this sort of product and this sort of work. I think you've done a great job limiting it in scope in such a way that you do still cover a lot of things but while still remaining it remains woven together and it has a thread to it. So it's not.
Well, you are I mean, this is the thing. Actually, I was quite pleased to be able to call it story, because if you're Italians and French, there's no difference between a story and a history. And I wanted slightly that feeling that it was a narrative, that it was moving on. I didn't want it to appear too much like a sort of a geographical plod around the area. What happened to this place? All these various things. I wanted it to have some sort of chronological feel about it, that it was a narrative moving on. The problem about that, of course, is that occasionally there's a big event. Let's take the Battle of Poltava, for example, with Karl XII and Peter of Russia. It's a major event on both sides, and I didn't want to put the two people into one chapter. I wouldn't do them justice. So obviously, again, you have a sight problem. Don't want to repeat things I've said too much, but I mustn't let the person who just reads this chapter not know what I'm talking about. So it's to avoid the repetition, but not let people get lost. And my main objective, I think I said it at the beginning, was I felt that this was an area, there's wonderful biographies, but again, they concentrate on one person and in great detail, and not so much about the fringe. There's some excellent, obviously, academic work, but there was very little sort of general introduction for the the person who likes reading quite serious books but doesn't want to be working their way through a lot of academic studies. So I wanted it something that was readable, if possible, that people would, even if it was quite hard work because it's long and there's a lot of detail, that they could actually follow what I was saying. This was what I was trying to do. And so sometimes, again, that influenced my decision. I thought I'm getting a little bit too intense here, perhaps just step it back a little bit, keep it within bounds of what somebody would enjoy picking up and reading.
No, of course. And I think I think you've done a really good job in weaving it together in a way that makes it both really informative and doesn't feel like it's just scratching the surface, but also you can follow along in a way that you say it has a narrative that's still a rich narrative, but it has that thread that you can sort of follow along.
Well, I shouldn't be interrupting you, but there's one thing here that actually helped me a lot. Because as I say, I didn't want it a geographical sort of trip round and just shove all the facts in one chapter. But it's just the way things developed. It was possible really to start with Denmark. And then as Denmark gradually sort of gave way to Sweden and then Sweden to Russia, it moved naturally across the Baltic. And then I decided intentionally not to take on the 20th century because, as I may say, my remit was to write something for people that didn't exist, that wasn't a general study. There's so much written about the 20th century, and I thought there's no way I can do justice to the 20th century in one chapter. It's been done so well, it's all there. So I basically ended with the First World War. But what was rather satisfactory for me, that the First World War appears in the last chapter, not counting the postscript, which concentrates on Empress Maria of Russia. And she was a perfect person to end with, I felt, because being Danish, that brought it back into a complete circle. And I thought in a way she welded the whole thing together by combining those two countries in that way.
It ties it back to the it ties it back to the beginning, so to speak.
Exactly.
Was there anything in the research itself that that surprised you when you were doing because again you must have read a lot to put this together? Was there any one of these realizations that you had where you really sort of went, oh wow, I never even had considered that?
Well, I think the extent, I mean, I mentioned it vaguely in that talk, but the extent of this sort of pragmatic approach of rulers, that not just that they could be at war with their wife's family or whatever it was, but it's the way, I mean, one of the really things that struck me, and I mentioned it in the book, but when Karl XII has spent 5-6 years doing all he can to defeat his cousin, Augustus the Strong of Poland, then they go. He goes and stays in his electorate, and then they meet each other. And just before he sets off for Russia, he goes and visits him, and they have dinner together and everything. And you find that again and again, that all these rulers, the Tsar mentions it in one place, Tsar Nicholas, and then there's also Napoleon mentions this, the way that they have to keep the private and the political lives apart in their mind, and it's not seen as a sort of there's no ill feeling about it, if you like. It's it's a separate issue. It's not personal, and that really struck me because it appears again and again.
No, it was one of those things that really jumped out at me when I was reading it. This particular sort of, they're all related. They're all cousins, brothers, sisters, whatever, all friends, and then they go at war with each other, and then the next thing you know, 6 months later, they're allies waging war against the third party.
Exactly.
And I think I'm going to jump on to ask you a question about the book to also serve as a bit of a kickstart to open up for the audience to ask about the presentation, also anything else that they feel might be relevant. So I'm going to take this opportunity for myself to start. Because one thing that I find really interesting, and that I think you did a very, very good job with, was lifting out to the involvement of women in this history, because very often you do read these sort of novels and books and studies and so on, where it's usually very kind of focused on like the kings or the tsars or whatever, not really thinking about how women, for example, I think you're right, are often used as sort of political pawns and spies and still very influential. Whether it might not be on the face of it so much, of course, with some exceptions like Catherine the Great of Russia and so on, but it's usually not uplifted so much in much other work of this sort of genre. Was this a conscious decision you made when researching and writing?
No, it wasn't. No, it was. I mean, funny enough, when I was doing my PhD, and I'm sure a lot of other people would agree with this, I remember one of my supervisors saying to me, "Karen, you've got to be very careful when you write your PhD. You mustn't have a preconceived idea about what you're going to find, because then you'll make a mistake. You'll put too much stress on it." So it very much developed itself. And as I was writing it, I would find certain women did come to the fore, just by the evidence that was there. And I thought that what I found very interesting, but I'm quite putting apart, is who say people like Margaret of Denmark and Catherine, who were both exceptional leaders in their own way. But a lot of those wives not only were sort of influential things, but they had such a tricky path. And were they supposed to, because of the intermarriage, there was often claims made to the same territory, because, oh, I own it because my grandmother had it, and another one saying no, it was my grandfather who had it. So there was this would lead to arguments, and how did they deal with it? And I very much found there seemed to be three sorts. So the ones who sort of got on with it and made quite an influence on their countries, others who just couldn't cope with it and sort of crumbled underneath the pressure. But it was it was the political dimension. It wasn't just the being packed off abroad to a total stranger and having to live in a horrible different climate or whatever it was. Yeah. It was the fact that you suspect quite often. Your brother would think you were letting him down, and your husband would think you were letting him down. And they had to sort of weave this terribly difficult path between it. And if they were too forceful, then they were seen as being too forceful. If they weren't forceful enough, they were ignored. So there was a sort of very particular problem for them. And funny enough, one of the things that really pleased me when I was doing the research was that my problem in the earlier part of the book was there was not much first-hand material, because on the whole you have somebody saying this was a marvelous king or a marvelous ruler or a marvelous general, and another one saying simply frightful, but there's not much the personal stuff. But as time goes on, the more and more letters, the more and more documents that exist. And I was therefore really pleased right at the beginning, really, when Christian II's poor little wife, Isabella, she wrote that very moving letter, which I cut somewhere in this book, that sort of describing just the difficulties of being sent abroad as a really young child, probably a terrible journey getting there anyway. Quite often they nearly were drowned on the way there. And then having to contend with a completely foreign court and how to manage it. So I thought that's what really struck me. It was the sort of the depth of problems that these very young children, actually, we would call them, I mean, if some of them were sort of 15 or something like that, had to cope with, really struck me, it struck home. But it wasn't intentional. It sort of came out of the research.
Excellent. I'm going to open it to the floor of the audience now. I'm just going to remind everyone that you are muted, but you can unmute yourselves. So, you know, don't just start speaking into a muted microphone. But if somebody has any question, if they could attempt to make themselves known, I will do my best to spot you. Yeah. And if nobody's doing anything, just turn your microphone off and try to make yourself known the audible way. So, anybody has any particular question?
Yes, I've got one in particular. My name is Björn Saven, a member of the Anglo-Swedish Society.
Excellent.
And that is, did you at all study the period when Napoleon and Alexander meet in 1807? I think the discussion in Sweden is often, wasn't it so that Bernadotte actually met Alexander and made the deal about Norway and Finland already at that time, that was discussed?
That I didn't know. That I will be honest. This is a new departure for me. I didn't come across this argument, but I have read a lot about the meeting, but I'd never sort of heard this other version that Bernadotte was behind it. I think
perhaps Alexander was behind it, but it was put into the minds of the French that maybe in the future it would be better if the Swedes were given Norway and Russia kept Finland.
Russia kept Finland.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I mean, I know that Bernadotte was supposed to have been disappointed to lose Finland, and this is one of the reasons why he was pleased to be.
I think Bernadotte was very keen to get Norway and didn't really care about Finland as the Swedish view.
I think it's more that. But that is interesting. Yes.
I have one other short comment, if I may, and that is, it might interest you, but I believe that the Kalmar Union for at least 75 years also encompassed Orkney and Shetland Islands, if that would give you a little bit of a British angle, so to say.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you.
Possibly the Orkneys too.
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Anybody else would have anything they'd like to raise? Any questions or comments, for that matter?
I'm just curious. How did you come to choose and fall in love intellectually with the Baltic region?
Well, as I say, I was interested in the in Prussia first of all, because I think. Actually, I don't think it has been mentioned, or it was vaguely mentioned, but we were, when I was first married, we were living, this is a long time ago now, we were living in Germany during the Cold War. And my husband was doing an exchange job with the Soviets. So we had this access across to East Germany the whole time. We used to I used to go once a week to Potsdam, and we went down to Leipzig and Dresden and things. And I'm talking now about, this is 1969, I mean, a long time ago. And I remember going around Sans Souci, and there was really nobody there in those days. It was extraordinary. I mean, I've been back since, and it's now beautiful and it's changed. But at that time, it was rather, I often describe it rather like Sleeping Beauty. It was all slightly under sort of in decay, but I was intrigued by the whole story of Frederick the Great. So that was at the back of my mind. And then really what finally brought it to the fore was, I say, when I was doing my PhD, it was on Voltaire and the Enlightenment. And Voltaire was a companion of Frederick the Great. He was a constant correspondent of Catherine the Great. He was a correspondent of the Swedish king and the Swedish queen and the Danish king. He wrote about Karl XII. He wrote about Peter the Great. There was so much in his work. And I got intrigued by his interest. And I then really wanted to discover, I was seeing his interpretation of these parts of the world, but I wanted to get their interpretation, if you like, of his thinking. And that sort of opened the way for me to start getting very involved in it. And then I was asked to start lecturing on cruise ships. And I suddenly realized that the things that I'd researched, most people hadn't come across. And a lot of people used to say to me, have you written a general study about this area? And I said, I haven't. They said, well, you ought to think about it. So eventually I decided I would do so. But it was really a funny thing to say, it came through that study, the Enlightenment, but that's where it first started.
Excellent. I think, I don't want to, oh, Michael, we do have one more question. We had time for one more. So Michael, go ahead.
Yeah.
Just in time, that though.
Unmute.
Remember, you're muted, so you'll have to unmute yourself, which you can do in the bottom left corner of your screen.
Right.
There you go.
Michael, St. John Parker. Could you say just a little bit about something which, at any rate to the English observer, often seems something rather odd, namely why the Swedes, at a moment of crisis in their monarchy, when there was no obvious local candidate, so to speak, turned to a maverick French soldier. Bernadotte eventually turned out to be, of course, a hugely successful choice. But how did they come to turn to France when, at the time, there were any number of German princes and other remote relatives, at any rate, of the Swedish family whom they could have chosen?
Well, there's sort of two or three things really here. One was the Swedish army admired him. He was a good soldier, and they thought that that might be quite a useful thing to have a person who was a good military man. They also slightly wondered whether he was, in fact, he had rather fallen out with Napoleon, but whether he might help them against the French. But the most significant thing really was that while I think it was in the third coalition, I always get these coalitions muddled, or was it the fourth coalition, I think it was, the French took various Swedish prisoners. And he treated them so well at Lubeck that he got a reputation for being an honourable, humane man. And so that was really why he was chosen. They'd already had a slight mishap, because as I say, that the previous candidate had died unexpectedly. So they were still looking. But it was really his sort of humanity and his military strength, I think, that led them to choose him. I don't know if that's enough.
I think that was a great answer. I think we have already run a little bit past the advertised time, but your talk was so interesting that we couldn't just cut it like that. But I think we're going to wrap up now. So I will hand it back to Alexander for just some closing remarks. And obviously, I'd also like to thank you, Caroline, for coming on here and doing the talk and allowing me to throw some questions at you, and then allowing the audience to throw a couple of questions at you. So thank you very much for that. And I'm handing it back to Alexander on that note.
Thank you very much. Well, first, of course, thank you very much for an excellent talk, Caroline. And we're hoping that you will accept, as just a token of thanks, a membership of the Anglo-Swedish Society for the rest of this year and for next year.
Oh, how kind. Thank you. That's
so
really
in that
kind.
case, we'll put you in the, I'll follow up by email.
I would love that. That would be wonderful. And thank you so much. I mean, when I'm speaking to a lot of, I'm sure, experts here with their own national experiences, much more than I have, I think it's really kind of you to have asked me tonight, and I've really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
We're adopting you as one of our own. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's really kind.
And also, of course, thank you to Eric Orlowski and David Goldsmith for arranging another amazing evening. It takes somebody to come up with and invite somebody and really drive through and have a clear concept, so we can all enjoy each other's company and learn something and have a rewarding time. So thank you so much. You each get a slightly bigger or finer bottle of champagne than I was going to do. After last time's excellent tea and coffee talk, where you were the speakers and the organisers.
It's our pleasure as always.
Yeah, absolutely. Love doing it.
Of course, thank you to everyone, our members, council members, members of sister societies, Swedish-British Society, Anglo-Finnish Society, and we have some reciprocal events with the Swedish-British, and enjoy those very much. And then, of course, and finally, the little plug, on Gustavus Adolphus Day, 6th of November, we will have a Zoom meeting with some of our scholars, where we will learn about glass blowing and music and so on, including some rather successful former scholars, and we will send out something about that. On the 1st of December, Robert Freeman has arranged a phantom carriage centenary. So Selma Lagerlöf's book Körkaren came out as a film under the same name, The Phantom Carriage, on New Year's Day 1921. So it's the centenary minus 1 month, and that promises to have some good footage and some music. It'd be rather subtle and interesting. Both dates for your diaries. Well, that's all from me as chairman of the Anglo-Swedish Society, and I'm very happy to have seen everyone this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thank you, Karen.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Fin evening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Goodbye. Thanks.
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you very much.